win some prizes. All right, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Jonathan Leitschuh. He's speaking on Zoom Zero Day, how not to handle a vulnerability report. So, welcome, John.
Hi, everybody. As I said before, my name is, oh, come on, please now. My name is Jonathan Leitschuh. I'm a software engineer and security researcher I currently work at Gradle, which is a build tool company used for building Java applications around the world. And you can find me on Twitter. So I got into software security in this space probably about a year and a half ago, where I found I kind of realized that the barrier to entry for finding security vulnerabilities is actually quite a bit lower than I expected, and started finding vulnerabilities and started poking, and this ended up being one of my pokes of curiosity. So let's talk about, so the agenda for this talk is I'm going to cover first the discovery of this vulnerability and the disclosure timeline around this vulnerability, and then kind of my disclosure policy and why I have the disclosure policy that I use. From there, we'll go and talk about the post-disclosure timeline, like what happened after the vulnerability was disclosed, and an analysis from the perspective of Zoom, how they handled this wrong so that it ended up kind of blowing up from a media perspective, to look bad upon them, and kind of the things that they had to do to roll that back. So one of the big questions that I get from people on a regular basis is, why were you looking at Zoom? And the simple answer was, I was curious. I wasn't really looking for a vulnerability. The big thing that for me was, I was looking, sorry. So I was curious how you could go from clicking a link like this to having a web page open on your browser to going to having a application on your local machine running. Like, what was that chain of events that allowed that to occur? And how is Zoom doing this in a way that was secure? And my initial thought was there might be some communication from your GET request in the browser going through to their servers and then bouncing back to your client on your local machine. I was curious how that worked. And so, what is this black magic that's going on behind the scenes that's allowing this behavior to occur? Because it is so seamless, and so many people are using it, and we were using it at my company at the time. I was working for Plexi, which at that time had been bought by Hewlett Packard Enterprise. So we were using it. And so the first thing that I did was I broke open the Chrome Developer Tools and started seeing this. Localhost connections. Why are there localhost connections? And you'll notice that there is a connection to something on port 19421, and I was confused. I was like, okay, so there's something running on my local machine, and it's talking, it's making GET requests for images, so it seems. Why images? And so I started digging into the JavaScript source code, and you start seeing stuff like this, right? So log, start, load image, right? And so first off, why are they making requests for images? Second off, instead of making regular requests for JavaScript, second off, what is this thing that's on my machine that is what is it doing? And the other thing that was kind of weird was there was this block of logic where the response of the image that came back seemed to be this enum. And so what I found out was that actually the response that this web server gave you was an image of a certain pixel dimension, and based upon the pixel dimension, you would return one of these error codes, right? So a 6x1 image was an invalid, or was a fail invalid domain, right? 1x1 image, success. And so that's how, I was like, okay, this is weird. Why are they giving data back over an image? That seems really weird. And so, at this point, right, so I had been able to figure out that One of the things I ended up trying from here was, all right, I see that this logic exists on their site. Can I make the same request that Zoom's website is making from another page, right? So I spun up my own website and tried it, and lo and behold, making the same GET request for an image popped my Zoom client open. But the component that was missing there, right? So I was able to, from that point, I was able to get you from my website, which was malicious, supposedly, right, in the attack scenario, I was able to get you into a video call without your permission, or sorry, into a call without your permission. The component that was missing, though, was I couldn't get you into a call with your video active, because the default for Zoom calls when you create them is that your video is off, right? So I'm like, okay, well, I've got part of something here. I've got you into a video call, but I don't know if I would necessarily consider that a vulnerability. It's like weird behavior, probably not expected user behavior, but I might not consider that a vulnerability, right? So, can we get video? Well, no. Maybe. Yeah, actually, yes, you can. And so, so I ended up sitting on this one for about a week. I went on vacation. When I came back, I noticed that when I was creating a meeting, I was using, so I normally did not create meetings myself. I either used like the Outlook client or something like that, but when I used the Zoom application to create a meeting, I noticed something interesting. This little setting for participants, where you can set the participants to have their video on by default when they join the call. And so what I found out was that if you as a user had not configured your Zoom client prior to, like, if you had just left it as the defaults, this setting would allow me as the host, when I set up the meeting, to tell your Zoom client, oh, join with your video when you come to join, right? So from there, I went to private disclosure. So when I had the first component, right, just around the video, I reached out to them over Twitter because I couldn't find a security place to report, right? So one of the things that I'll do is I will try to find a security location to report something. I'll reach out to the company over Twitter saying, hey, where is your security reporting thing? And usually you get a contact back saying, here, send it to this email. No response from Twitter. So I finally opened a support ticket. And that actually got a response, which is good. And so I laid out the whole details of the vulnerability, like, here's the proof of concept with like a website that just joined, like it's an image. The website was a simple image GET request in an HTML document. This will join anybody to a web browser or to a Zoom meeting without the permission. And the other component to this is I have a disclosure policy. And the disclosure policy that I use is this. This responsible disclosure follows Google's 90-day vulnerability disclosure policy. I'm not an employee of Google. I just like their policy. That's actually something that I put in every email that I send. And then something that I've since added since this Zoom component, since this Zoom vulnerability, and more recently, is full disclosure will occur either at the end of 90-day deadline or whenever a patch is made widely available, whichever occurs first. And so why, I guess one of the big questions that we want to ask is why 90 days, right? 90 days is Google's policy. I had a chat with Katie Masuris about this, who has been doing vulnerability disclosure for years. And she said one of the original OG vulnerability disclosure deadlines was a week. Different times. Also, it was much harder for people to patch things back then because there weren't automated update processes, right? Google's policy kind of, I believe, stems from trying to wrap their disclosure timeline around finding vulnerabilities in Microsoft stuff. And Microsoft has a 1-month release cycle, right? So they release their updates every 1 month. And so this 90 days gives 3 release cycles for Microsoft and some of these big companies that have some of those long sort of release cycles to get their fixes into those release cycles in one of those fixed systems. Some companies have 90 days, some companies have 45 days disclosures. But I do fundamentally believe that, especially when you're shipping software, a disclosure deadline is important. And it for two components, right? One component is it gives the company, it puts fire under the company to get it fixed, because otherwise they can just let it sit, right? It doesn't become a priority unless there's a timeline. And the other component is that it's important that these things become public, because if they're not public, then people don't know that there are vulnerabilities that they need to patch, right? And so I also regularly, when I find vulnerabilities in stuff, I make sure that I get a CVE number for the vulnerabilities that I find. And so when I sent my email to Zoom, I got a response, and they said, "Great, thank you so much. Here, we will invite you to our bug bounty program," which they did. Which was on, it was a bug bounty program. They invited me to the program, and I started reading through the rules and the rules of their disclosure. And this is what I found. Please note, this program does not allow disclosure. You may not release information about vulnerabilities found in this program to the public. And also, their payouts were low. It would have been between, given what I'd found, they were. I think the payout they were looking at was between $300 and $800. And so my response was, I can't in good conscience participate in your bug bounty program given the terms of your program. And so I said, I'm not going to disclose through your bug bounty program. I'm going to instead choose to continue to use email. And their response was, okay, fine, sure, all right. So that's the channel that we continued to move through. So after I disclosed this, I started poking around a little bit more. And I found some more things that were kind of interesting. So I decompiled the Zoom client. So here's the interesting thing. I ended up looking for, so remember that port, I don't remember the number, 19 something. I ended up looking to see, okay, where is the process that was launched what process was bound to that port, right? And I found that there was a Zoom application that was not in the Zoom app, but was installed in your home directory, separate from the Zoom app, right? And it had a bit of code, like get download URL, and I was like, this is interesting, and that was gated by this logic, which, yeah, right. So that's why if you look at it, it says if R4 is equal to string, and then these are the different strings that they had, right? And so I wasn't quite certain. I'm not very good with decompiled code, especially Objective-C, but it looked like there was some download logic going on, where they were allowing downloads from one of these domains, and I didn't have an answer as to what was going on, but I did check out zoomgov.com, and the DNS record for that was about to expire in about 4 days. So 4 days. There's another component here. I'll get there. So I also disclosed this to the Chromium project and the Mozilla team, and the reason behind that was I was curious. I was not accurate in this, but I believed that CORS, which is the cross-origin resource request protections that browsers have in place to prevent, for example, you from making a cross-origin. Your website, which is like maliciouscatvideos.com, can't make a JavaScript or JSON post request to a resource like Google.com, right? So they can't impersonate your account. Similar protections, I believe, should be in place around things like localhost, like the local IP system. And I was like, yo, browsers, why do these systems are not in place? And their response was, there's a what's it called? An RFC in flight. There's an RFC in flight around fixing this, but it's not a bug in the browser. So both of them ended up closing it. Actually, but then Mozilla reopened it. It wasn't a bug against Mozilla Firefox. They reopened it as a bug against their internal infrastructure because it was Zoom, and they were using Zoom. And so they ended up inviting me to a video call with Zoom to discuss this vulnerability, which was the first kind of video interaction that I had with Zoom about this. And in that meeting, I brought up the DNS record that was about to expire, and I said, I don't know what this logic quite does, but it looks like there's some download logic in here, and that DNS record's about to expire. If you let it expire, that might turn into remote code execution, maybe. And their response was, great, we'll get that fixed, and it was fixed by the time that I got home that evening. So that DNS record had been refreshed, and they'd made sure they'd upped it again. Okay, so time goes on. At this time, I'm actually changing companies. At the end of that, we're getting very close to the end of the 90-day disclosure windows that I gave them. And I'm telling them, guys, like, you guys don't have a fix out. Like, you've had all this time. What's going on here? It was probably about 2 weeks before the end of the 90-day disclosure window where they came to me and said, here's our plan for how we're going to fix this. And I ended up saying, well, you've got a hole here, 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 and here. And we had a discussion, and they were not the end vulnerability that I ended up finding, but there were some minor things with their fix around they were going to validate based upon the IP address making the request. And I was like, well, if you have somebody else that's on the same NAT, is behind the same NAT router as you both have the same IP address, you can still perform the same attack if you're both behind the same NAT router. And they said, well, that's like, I think that the opinion was that's a much lower level attack, right? And so we get to about 4 days before the end of the 90-day disclosure window. And I'm sending them emails. I'm now onboarding with my new company in another country. And I'm like, look, like, I'm not going to have time to actually look at this vulnerability. So they did fix it 4 days before my disclosure. They fixed it so my POC no longer worked. And I told them, I said, look, if I find a bypass for this fix, if you had been willing to work with me before, like not 4 days before the end of the 90-day disclosure window, I would have been more than happy to have reviewed this fix, given you guys feedback, followed up, right? But you guys pushed it out to the end of the 90 days. If I find a bypass, I'm going public in 24 hours. Yeah. So we hit the public disclosure deadline, and life got in the way. I had just started a new job, so I didn't have time to go public the day of. I was actually flying back to the US that day. And the time that I actually had to sit down and begin writing out my write-up took me another 2 weeks. And so I ended up it ended up being 4th of July weekend where I actually had time to sit down and write up this write-up, right? So that all got fixed, right? That's what I thought. And so I was like, okay, like, I'm going to go write this up, and we'll say, yes, like, they did fix it. I'm not pleased with their time, but yeah, they did fix it, and like, here's the whole story, right? Because I believe that fundamentally that web server, they did leave that web server behind, right? And my thought was, okay, like, I don't know enough about this web server, and I don't have the skills. I still don't have the skills to decompile an application like that and find vulnerabilities in it, but it's running on lots of computers. Somebody else should take a look at this, and the only way that I'm going to be able to get that is probably by publishing and getting somebody else to follow up on my research, hopefully. But I found a bypass for their fix. I simply loaded their website in an iframe on my site, and so I could just have all of their code. So what I found was that my logic, when my original POC, while it's no longer allowed you to join with a video active, it still allowed you to get a video call activated via the GET request, right? So my POC stopped working in the component of getting the video active, but when I ran their whole site, it's still rejoined with the video active, right? Just like before. And so if I just put their code, whatever their code's doing that's right, which I don't have to recreate, on my site, and I hide it, so for those who are not familiar, iframes are a way of embedding other websites' code in your site. This is how all ads are rendered, right? Ads are rendered in iframes to basically keep that code that is untrusted contained. It's also a way of pulling off a couple of vulnerabilities, including things like clickjacking. So I started doing the math. So I followed up and I said, hey, Zoom, I found a bypass, and I'm going public in 24 hours. I'm writing up my thing, and I said I will send you the full write-up before I go public. And they were clearly not thrilled, but I mean, there was not much they could do about it. They did say, I mean, one of the things they said was, well, this is a different vulnerability. And I said, no, I warned you about that web server. That web server is probably a security vulnerability and probably not something that I would trust on my computer, right? Like an arbitrary web server running something, an undocumented API. So I did some estimations on the number of vulnerable Macs that were possibly vulnerable to this. So this was only on Mac. It was not on Windows. But Zoom, as of 2015, had like 40 million users. And Macs, right, are about 10% of the PC market. And so they'd had significant growth since 2015. So my estimation was about 4 million Macs were vulnerable to this vulnerability before I went public. And what about that download logic we were looking at before? Right? Remember that? I couldn't figure out? So what happens if I uninstall Zoom? It reinstalls itself. What? That was my reaction. So you can't even protect yourself by uninstalling Zoom. Because the web server is not in, if you guys have a Mac, that web server is not in the zoom.app file. It's in your home directory under a .zoomus directory, which has that web server running, right? So, put that in my write-up. So, I went public about this the next morning. They did ask for an extra 3 hours, which I gave them because they're in California and they wanted to have their team online. And I'm like, okay, fine, sure, yes, that's fine. I went public. That was the headline that I used. I did not know about remote code execution, but I thought there might be one, and I had almost found one, but, you know. And so, from here, I had a proof. So part of this was I had a proof of concept in the write-up. I had a link in the write-up that said, here, if you want to try out this vulnerability, there are 2 links. One was with just the image, which would not join with your video, and the other one was the one here, join with your video, and explicit warning, like you will be joined to a video call with your video camera active. Just a heads up. And we ended up with what we called the Zoom chat roulette. Yeah, 4,000 upvotes on this tweet. I think it actually got more likes than my own tweet about this vulnerability. Yeah, so this chat roulette ended up running for about 3 days straight. It was interesting. Yeah, the internet's weird. Yeah, but we also tried to be useful. This was one of the things. So Zoom, when it's an unmoderated Zoom meeting, you have a hard time controlling who's in charge of presenting, and you can't take control of the presenter from somebody else. So when one of us that we were responsible managed to wrest control of the Zoom meeting because I didn't even own the meeting. It was actually one of the demo links that they gave me for making sure their testing vulnerability was fixed. I just used their link because it was longer lasting than my link, so I didn't have a pro account. So I used their link that they gave me for this example, and so we put up a banner like this as here's how to fix this if you're here because you're vulnerable, right? So we were trying to help guide people into fixing this, and so we had a whole write-up that was written by Karin, who's a friend of mine that I met since this vulnerability as a part of this, who basically ran the whole here's how to fix yourself. Across these 3 days, we had quite a few people join. We ended up with about 1,300 people joining this call, and that's just the people that joined while was connected, because every single time you have somebody join, you get their icon downloaded to your computer. So these are all the icons of people that were actually in the meeting. And so what was Zoom's initial response to this? Not a vulnerability. To quote from them and their initial stance, we consciously enable the ability to have meeting joins initiated from within an iframe on a web page. Yeah, right, exactly. When asked whether it was a concern that such iframes require no click, and this is from BuzzFeed actually, they replied, no, that's not a security concern. Actually, interesting side note, when I posted my tweet about this vulnerability, first news organization to reach out to me, which was kind of fun, was BuzzFeed. Did not expect. They do some really good reporting, but of all the news organizations to reach out to me first, I was not expecting it to be BuzzFeed. I didn't actually expect any news agencies to reach out to me, but you know, be it what it is. So there's a fundamental problem here, right? And the fundamental security vulnerability that I was exposing to them was their core feature, right? Their core feature was, we are one click, join you to a meeting, and it's that simple, right? And I don't have anything against that, except for when you can't do that in a way that's secure and that somebody else can abuse to get you to that meeting, right? And so I have not seen a video solution, as far as I'm aware, that allows that one click, that doesn't potentially have some sort of vulnerability in that chain, right? So what about Windows? So interestingly enough, Windows does not have doesn't have that web server, right? But if you checked this always allow these types of links in the associated app. This is a protocol handler, Zoom meeting : / right? You can applications on your local computer can register handlers with the operating system for when these URL handlers get triggered to get handled by various apps, including your browser, right? If you checked always allow these types of links in the associated app, then that you would not get prompted about joining this call, and Zoom would just pop open. So Windows people were just as vulnerable. So back to the Zoom chat roulette. So yeah, so we learned all this. We were also telling people, right, you need to actually go and check these settings. We'll get to day 2, right? So I went public on Monday, the 8th. The 9th rolls around. I'd been up till 5 a.m. in the morning. That was a stupid choice on my behalf. But yeah, so 5 a.m. in the morning. Slept for about 3 hours. And the next day, the video call was still running, full ramp. We ended up with about 100 people consistently in the call at any one time across those 2 days. At around 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the CEO of Zoom actually joins the call, which I had not expected. We had somebody actually the night before that was impersonating the CEO of Zoom and said that they were on the call with the fake name. It was not actually him. I asked him afterwards if it was him. He said no. But the actual CEO of Zoom, Eric Yuan, joined the call. And we ended up having a really interesting dialogue with, at this point, myself, Karin, and 160 people in this video call all at the same time about this vulnerability. I discussed the vulnerability. We discussed some other things we found out. For example, that all video conferences in Zoom were unencrypted by default. I had since, after that, had a competitor, so like a day later, had a competitor come to me and say, by the way, we have a proof of concept that can decrypt that we can side channel decrypt any Zoom conference in flight. So that vulnerability. We also discussed various other things like the bug bounty that was, the payouts were low, and some other components. The end result was that Zoom ended up, they made a step back, they took a step back and said, you know what, you're right, this is a vulnerability, we will fix it. And they did end up issuing a patch Tuesday night to get rid of that web server. The problem with that, though, is if you'd ever uninstalled Zoom, you would have to update or reinstall Zoom to remove that web server, right? So the web server, it's like the gift that keeps on giving. So yeah. So the things that he ended up agreeing to as part of this meeting, right, were that they would remove the daemon, they'd encrypt the chat by default, they'd have a public bug bounty program, or at least a public disclosure, like a vulnerability disclosure that is public, and increasing the bug bounty payouts on their private program. Yeah, so they have since done that. And then, thankfully, Apple gets involved. I really appreciate the Apple engineers for getting involved with this, because there was no way that Zoom was going to get rid of that that web server. Because if you'd uninstalled Zoom, it would have lived on forever on a lot of people's computers. That becomes more important in a little bit. So, also, Zoom got a real fix out. They now have a dialog preview window that pops up when you join a video call. It says, I would like to, I want to join, with my video or with my video off. And the only downside of this is that checkbox that you can still disable. But at least at that point, it's quite a bit more willing. So we're good, right? Yeah, so I missed something. But wait, there's more. Yeah, a gift that keeps on giving. So, Risky Business. I woke up on Wednesday morning, and I'm listening to Risky Business, which is a really great podcast. If you're looking for an information security podcast that will wake you up and realize, oh wow, the world's a scary place. I recommend Risky Business. They open with, yeah, there's a Zoom vulnerability, but by the way, there's this remote code execution vulnerability. It's really easy to pull off. And I'm like, well, I can't publish. How do I not know about this? Well, because I'm not that good at decompiling code. Yeah. So on the 17th, week later, AssetNote actually did a write-up of the remote code execution vulnerability, and yeah. So there is a wait. Am I? Yeah. Okay. So remember that first bit of logic where I said there was that if check to check if Zoom, if you have is equal, right? So going way back, is equals zoomgov.com, right? There was this other bit of logic that was in there afterwards. You guys spot the security vulnerability here? I didn't, so don't worry about it. That right there is checking to see if those same domains, if it has the suffix of that domain on the URL provided. So, if you were to supply, for example, that as your GET request for the domain attack.zoomus, it would parse it and it would say, yeah, that does have the suffix of .zoomus. And you could supply your own file from that domain. Yeah. So I missed that one a little bit, but yeah. So they went public with that, and they have a proof of concept. Let's see if I can. Yeah. So they actually, thanks to AssetNote, yeah, they. Yep. There you go. And calculator. Yeah. Yeah, so there was a remote code execution vulnerability in that web server. But this is still the gift that just keeps on giving. Oh, come on now. You guys know what white labels are? So this is apparently very popular in the car industry, where companies will buy other companies' cars, put their brand on it, and resell it. Apparently, Zoom was doing this with a couple companies. RingCentral. Yeah, there was 13. I only could find logos for these 5, but But yeah, so Ring Central, which is really big in the telecom industry, Telus Meeting, BT Cloud phone meetings, Office Suite HD, AT&T, BizConf, Hudi, Zoomu, which is a Chinese version of Zoom, Zoom CN, Earthlink. Yeah, like so all these companies were all white labels of Zoom software.
Did you say Earthlink?
Yes.
What year is it?
Earthlink Meeting Room was the and like video conference, telemex, and accession meeting. Yeah, so all these were also vulnerable to the same remote code execution vulnerability. Yeah. Thankfully, Apple stepped in again, and they've also removed all of these from your computer. So the thing that I learned about Apple as part of this is Apple has software that can remove malware from your computer. They call it malware removal tool. They didn't consider Zoom software malware, but it was the tool for the job, so they used it. And I really appreciate that they used it because now everybody, the 4 million plus people, are not vulnerable to remote code execution vulnerabilities if they've uninstalled these applications and left the web server behind. So what about Zoom now, right? They now have a public vulnerability disclosure system. If you go to zoom.us/security, you'll find a link to be able to report vulnerabilities publicly. They now have a staging area for joining meetings, and they are significantly ramping up their security stance. I can't really state what I know, but I've talked to a lot of people, and I know that they are significantly improving their security stance in this space. They are doing hiring, and they are engaged in conversations with the right people to improve this situation in the future. So there is like a vested interest in trying to prevent this from happening again. Like yes, so there has been learning in this area. What about browsers? So no, we're good. We're good. I think we've reached all the heart-dropping sort of moments. So you remember that join Zoom the URL protocol handler? You'll notice that the checkbox is gone in Chrome. So yay, awesome. You now have to always say yes. And Firefox. Okay, well, come on. I actually need to follow. I have an open issue with Firefox, and I need to follow up with them. Yeah. So just want to take a little bit of extra time and just talk about like how this went wrong, right? Like a couple components here, right? Zoom, they handled this vulnerability in such a way that they immediately took a vulnerability that was public and people could see, and they said, no, this is not a vulnerability. And so I think that a fundamental part of this was that the culture at Zoom, and I think that we can all, like everybody at any of our companies, can get wrapped up in this idea of what we're selling is like awesome, right? And like we get to expect the behavior that we know about because we have a deep and intimate relationship with that technology, right? And for Zoom, they were all about video conferencing, right? They had a culture where the CEO, this is what I've heard, was that that he would sit in video calls at his desk and just invite people to come join those video calls to talk to him, right? Like that was a fundamental part of their culture, was video is an open door to come communicate with people, right? And when somebody comes in and says your core value add has a fundamental security vulnerability about it, that's going to be really hard for a company to listen to and hear, right? And so one of the components here was the ability to kind of take your software and be willing to think about it as, no, running in this certain scenarios, like people don't expect it to behave like this, right? That can be really hard, but it's important when certain vulnerabilities like this come up, right? The other component is there's this analogy of two batons, and when any breach occurs or anything like that, there's two batons. One is that this is not really a big issue, right? And then there's the other side, which is, yeah, this is a big deal, right? And whichever one you pick up, the media is going to probably pick up the other one, right? And so there's this component to it where you kind of want to validate how people are going to feel about this thing. Because if you don't, you're going to end up having the public and the media possibly take up that alternative view that you don't want. The other component is making sure that all the information is out there. And I think did a nice job with its rolling back and being willing to take an analysis of its situation and say, you know what? This was a mistake, and we will fix it. So the other component that I don't have slides for is the follow-up that I had with both BugCrowd and HackerOne. So after this whole disclosure program, after this whole disclosure went through, one of the things that you'll notice about BugCrowd, in these programs, is that a lot of these companies have private programs, right? They have companies that have private programs on them. And these private programs usually have non-disclosure agreements to them, right? Oh Lord, my computer's dying. Well, it's fine. I don't need the slides right now anyways. Yeah, don't worry about it. Thanks. So HackerOne and BugCrowd both have these programs, but there's no really good way of saying, like, I have a bug in a company's software. For example, a company that runs their bug bounty program through HackerOne or BugCrowd, and say, I would like to disclose this vulnerability, but I don't agree to the terms of the bug bounty program, right? Like, I don't fundamentally have, like, the terms that I use don't agree with the terms of the bug bounty program. And interesting response that I got from BugCrowd, which they have since apologized for, was an immediate response of, yes, like, we're really glad that you didn't disclose via their program or during using their bug bounty program, and then try to hold it to a 90-day disclosure window. Basically, you probably would have been evicted from the platform had you done that. And so, yes, I'm grateful that I didn't use, because I'd like to still be able to use BugCrowd in the future. HackerOne took a different approach. They actually changed their policy around disclosure, and they added some guidance for people that wanted to disclose vulnerabilities that did not conform to the bug bounty program for the company. And they said, you can disclose it through us via our just general reporting, and they will guide you to the right channels, right? So there are a lot of problems with bug bounty programs currently where it's hard to hold these companies to disclosure windows, because fundamentally, when they have these private programs, they say no disclosure, they're kind of buying your silence. And I don't really agree with that, especially, right, if in this Zoom case, had I not gone public, Apple probably wouldn't have stepped in and fixed this, right? It wouldn't have been public. Nobody would have known about this. And who would have come in to get rid of this remote code execution from millions of computers, right? And so non-disclosure, when it comes to big issues like this, can be really, really detrimental in the long term. And so I think that public disclosure is an important part of this process, especially when we have shipped software. It's not as necessarily as important when you have a SaaS service, right, that the company is only their software for. But when you're dealing with distributed software that's sold like this, there should be CVEs assigned. There should be public disclosure of these things. And you should have a remediation. And you need to also maybe engage with Apple to say, hey, we need to get rid of this. So, come on now. Come back up, please. I think that's about it for me. My HDMI connection has cut out.
You are not the first.
Oh, it just turned off. All right. So, I'll give it a half second. So it's just my thank you slide. You can reach me, find me on Twitter at Panasonic. Okay, so you can find me at Leitschuh, so my last name, which nobody. There we go. So you can find me on Twitter. I do have DMs open. I also had a lot of people that have since come to me and say, hey, I found this X weird thing. What do you think? And I've been like, I will have a look, or I have other people that I now know that can help you look at things, because there are other people that I realize are out there that can help you figure out the dynamics of the vulnerability. And so, yeah, so are there any questions this time? Yeah, anything? Yes?
Zoom's Bug Buddy program, can you tell us about the changes to it as far as in respect to dollars and respect to the non-disclosure?
It's still private. So the reason that I can say they have a private bug bounty program is because they have a public thing that now says they have a public bug bounty program. I do not feel comfortable sharing that information because the information that I know is technically I'm in their program and not allowed to talk about. So, right, like, yeah. In response though, I do want to say, so I did turn down the initial bug bounty program. The CEO of Zoom I've since had a lot of conversations with him. He did really appreciate that I went public about that. Well, he's appreciative of the end results, right? At the end of this whole thing, I did end up with a sizably larger bug bounty paid out. I'm not going to say how much, but it netted me quite a bit more money, and my college loans are quite a chunk off of that, which is appreciated. So, yes.
How much is your silence worth?
Yeah, I don't have a number, and yeah, right, yeah, how many zeros, right, I know.
Wait, so you're unwilling to talk about their private bug bounty program because they pay you more money now?
No, I haven't actually.
You think everyone should know about this bug, but what about other bugs?
So I'm not willing to disclose I'm in their bug bounty program. If I were to disclose the amount, I would be at risk of getting thrown off of Bug Crowd in general, right? And so I don't necessarily, I mean, I could probably comfortably leave Zoom's bug bounty program because I'd probably disclose via their public channel anyways. In the future, I probably would not use their private bug bounty program because their rules are still non-disclosure, right, in that private program. I would not use that, right? So I don't know if that quite answers your question. And as to my selling point, I fundamentally believe that user security matters, right? I also really like telling a story, and like those two components tied together, right? Like I don't want to have my silence bought, except for if I'm necessarily working for a company, right? Like that I think is understandable, but when you're like finding vulnerabilities, especially when there are vulnerabilities that are important to become public because they impact a much wider like space, you have shipped a piece of software, and if you don't go public about it, you're not necessarily going to get the response for a fix that you need for that vulnerability. That's where it's a serious problem. So, yeah. Anybody? Yes?
Did Apple reach out to you?
No, I reached out to them. I sent them the information. There's a dynamic there that I also can't talk about. So, yeah.
A couple drinks in it, huh?
Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, please also feel free to come up and talk to me afterwards. Like, I'm happy to chat about any of this afterwards. So, yeah. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your humorous laughter. The only other thing is, like, the slide carousels were from Slide Carnival, so appreciate them for giving me the nice backgrounds. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.